The man known to history as Jesus Christ, or Yeshua in his native Aramaic tongue, was born into a world most of us have never fully understood. Not because the story is simple, because we've inherited layers of interpretation built across 2,000 years, each one filtering what came before. Here's what matters: almost everything we think we know about Jesus, his birth date, his actual words, what his death meant, has been scrutinized by scholars, historians, and archaeologists who separated faith from evidence. And the evidence tells a story quite different from tradition. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to show you what the texts actually say, what history recorded, and where tradition added weight that the original sources don't carry. In a minute, I'll show you what the early Christians actually believed about the resurrection, and it's not what most churches teach. But first, let's establish something clear. The Bible is quieter than we expect. Most people read past the inconsistencies. They don't ask why 4 accounts of the same events contradict on crucial details. They accept the timeline they were taught in childhood, never checking when these Gospels were actually written or who wrote them. That's not your fault. The scholarship exists, but it's locked behind academic journals and university seminars. What I'm doing here is translating that research into plain language. Here's the reality: we have more historical uncertainty about Jesus than many of us realize. The Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses. They were written 40 to 70 years after Jesus died. Most scholars believe they were written by anonymous authors, and only later attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to make them sound more authoritative. When you understand that single fact, everything shifts, not because the Gospels become worthless, but because you have to ask different questions about them. What exactly were these authors trying to do? What were they emphasizing? What were they downplaying or omitting entirely? Now here's the twist. Most people assume that if something isn't eyewitness testimony, it's unreliable. But that's not how historians work. A source written 50 years later can still preserve authentic historical memory if you know how to read it. The problem is understanding which parts are memory and which parts are theology, dressed up as history. In 1985, biblical scholars convened what they called the Jesus Seminar. Their goal was simple: identify what could be reliably attributed to the historical Jesus versus what the gospel writers added. Their findings: 16% of the deeds and 18% of the sayings attributed to Jesus in the canonical Gospels were likely authentic. That number startles people. Most people see it and think so. 82% of what Jesus said never happened. But that's not what the data means. It means that out of the hundreds of sayings and miracles recorded across 4 Gospels, somewhere between 16 and 18% met the scholars' rigorous criteria for historical authenticity. The rest weren't necessarily invented. They were shaped, emphasized, interpreted through the lens of what each community believed. And that's actually important to understand, because it reveals how the early church worked. Let's establish the historical context first. Jesus was born during the reign of Caesar Augustus, sometime between 7 BC and 4 BC. Not a D1. That date, that neat year 1 came from a 6th century monk's calculation, and he got it wrong. Most scholars believe the earlier date, based on circumstantial evidence: the death of King Herod, the census records, the way Roman administration worked in Judea at that time. Nothing in the Gospels gives us a precise date. Matthew mentions a star, Luke mentions a census, John doesn't mention his birth at all. This is the first major inconsistency most people never notice. When 3 of 4 Gospel writers tell the same story differently, that tells you something about their priority. They weren't focused on getting biographical details right. They were focused on meaning. Now, the world Jesus entered was politically unstable. Roman occupation of Judea had created enormous tension. The Jewish population had experienced decades of resistance movements, each one promising liberation, each one crushed by Rome. Messiahs kept appearing, people claiming to be divinely appointed liberator. Most were killed by Rome. Some left behind followers who reorganized and tried again. This is crucial context, because when Jesus began his ministry, he wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was one voice in a landscape crowded with prophets, healers, and would-be liberators. What distinguished him, what made people follow him, was something specific. Unlike John the Baptist, who operated from the River Jordan and attracted crowds from across Judea and Jerusalem, Jesus worked in the towns and villages of Galilee. He didn't go to the temple. He didn't seek confrontation with Jerusalem authority, at least, not at first. Instead, he taught in synagogues, by the sea, in people's homes. His 12 apostles, his core followers, were not aristocrats or scholars. They were fishermen, tax collectors, ordinary people. This detail matters because it tells you that his movement wasn't elite. It wasn't centered on Jerusalem's power structures. It was grassroots, decentralized, and it grew through personal relationship. This is where it gets interesting. Jesus taught something radical for his time: social reversal. He spoke about the last being first and the first being last. He taught that the poor were blessed while the rich faced judgment. He welcomed sinners, touched the sick, and associated with people deemed ritually unclean. From the perspective of Jewish religious law, which had developed elaborate systems of purity and separation, Jesus was breaking fundamental rule, but he wasn't teaching revolutionary politics in the modern sense. He wasn't calling for armed rebellion against Rome. He was teaching about God's kingdom, a spiritual reality, where God's values inverted human hierarchies. Most people miss the distinction because they read Jesus through the lens of modern political category. But to understand what actually happened, you have to think inside the first-century Jewish framework. His healing miracles, and the Gospels record many of them, were interpreted by his followers as signs of divine favor. Notice that carefully: divine favor, not divinity. People in the ancient world didn't think healers were gods. They thought they were people through whom God worked. There's a profound difference. Jesus never explicitly claimed to be God in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's Gospel is different. It includes I am statements that can be read as divine claims. But scholars almost universally believe John was written last and reflects more developed theology than the earlier accounts. This is the part nobody notices. The earliest layers of the gospel tradition show Jesus as an anointed prophet and healer, not as God incarnate. The divine Christology developed over time, not from the beginning. Here's where it gets expensive, historically speaking. By the time the later Gospels were written, Christianity had already begun its transformation from a Jewish movement into a Gentile religion. This shift changed everything about how the Jesus story was told and interpreted. The arrest and crucifixion happened around 29 to 30 AD. Most scholars agree on this date based on when Pontius Pilate served as prefect and when John the Baptist was active. Jesus was arrested by Jewish authorities, interrogated about whether he claimed to be the Messiah, and then handed over to Pilate for execution. The charge: sedition against Rome. He was crucified as a political criminal. Now the Gospels disagree on the details of the trial. Mark's account shows primarily Jewish religious charges. Luke shows emphasis on political charges to Pilate. John provides dialogue that emphasizes Jesus' claim to be king of the Jews as provocation to the Roman authority. The inconsistencies here are not small. They are fundamental. Each gospel shaped the story to emphasize different things about Jesus. Confrontation with power. And here's the crucial question: why did the gospel writers feel compelled to reshape this narrative over time? The answer connects to what happened after Jesus died. Pay attention to this part. Something happened that convinced his followers he hadn't simply been another failed Messiah to be forgotten. They reported experiencing him after his death, seeing him, speaking with him, believing he had been raised. Now, what did they actually believe about the resurrection? This is where most modern Christianity diverges sharply from what scholars believe the earliest Christians thought. The earliest writings we have are Paul's letters, written in the 50s AD, only 20 years after Jesus died. Paul speaks about resurrection, not as a physical resuscitation, but as transformation into a spiritual body. He uses language like imperishable, glory, power, describing something fundamentally different from the flesh and blood resurrection described in later Gospels. The original disciples' resurrection experiences, what they meant by seeing the risen Jesus, may have been visions or spiritual encounters, not physical appearances. The physical resurrection narrative, empty tomb, touching wounds, eating fish, develops most fully in Luke and John. The latest Gospel, Mark, the earliest, shows women visiting the tomb and finding it empty, but ends with no appearance account. Matthew adds appearances, but in symbolic locations, not continuous physical presence. The Gospel accounts actually show a progression, not consistency, and that progression tracks with how theology developed in the early church. 20 to 25 years of oral tradition, plus 40 to 70 years of written gospel traditions, equals a story that shifted and deepened based on community experience and theological reflection. Here's where the loop closes. The early Christians didn't preserve a fixed biography. They preserved a living tradition that transformed as communities grappled with what Jesus' death and resurrection meant. But something else happened that reshaped the entire narrative. As the movement spread west into the Roman Empire, it increasingly became Gentile rather than Jewish. Within a generation or two, the church leadership was almost entirely non-Jewish. This created a crisis of identity. How did you maintain this Jewish movement while it became increasingly non-Jewish? One solution blamed the Jewish authorities for Jesus' death, not Rome. The later Gospels show a pattern. Matthew emphasizes Jewish guilt more than Mark. Luke adds a scene where the Jewish crowd takes responsibility. John pushes the blame even harder onto the Jews. Scholars recognize this as theological reshaping to help Gentile Christians distinguish themselves from Jewish synagogues during a period of conflict. This doesn't mean the accounts are entirely fabricated. It means they were written through a particular community's lens at a particular moment. Understanding that distinction between historical event and theological interpretation is the real work of historical Jesus scholarships. Now here's what's remarkable. Even with all this uncertainty, certain things remain historically probable. Jesus was baptized by John. That's attested in all 4 Gospels, plus non-Christian sources. It's embarrassing to early Christians that John baptized Jesus, which made them keep it in the story anyway. Jesus spoke in parables and aphorisms. His teaching style is consistent across all sources. Jesus was executed by crucifixion under Pilate. That's attested in all Gospels and in Tacitus, a Roman historian. Jesus called 12 followers and trained them. The list of names varies slightly between Gospels, but the core practice is consistent. His followers believed something happened that vindicated him after death. Even critics of Christianity in antiquity didn't deny that followers claimed this. So there's a historical core, a set of probable facts that remain even when you strip away the layers of interpretation. But here's what's crucial: that core doesn't include everything that theology later built on it. It includes a Jewish preacher who taught about God's kingdom, who welcomed outsiders, who was executed by Rome, and whose followers experienced something they interpreted as resurrection. Everything else, the virgin birth, the detailed miracles, the physical resurrection appearances, the exact words of teachings, exists in the literary tradition, which we have to read with historical care. This is the second loop. Closing. The historical Jesus and the Christ of faith are not the same thing. That's not a criticism of either. It's an observation about how history works and how faith works. History deals with evidence, testimony, probability, and document. Faith deals with meaning, significance, personal transformation, and commitment. The two operate in different register. You can be historically rigorous about what the sources actually say, while simultaneously believing Jesus matters theologically. They're not mutually exclusive, though we often treat them as if they are. Most people never hear this distinction because it requires sitting with complexity. It requires saying, some of what I believe comes from historical fact, some comes from theological interpretation, and I can hold both. That's harder than pure fundamentalism, which claims it's all historical fact, or pure skepticism, which claims it's all invented. Sitting with the actual evidence is messier, but it's more honest. By the end of the 1st century, Jesus had been transformed from a 1st century Jewish preacher into the cosmic Christ of Gentile Christianity. Not because people were lying, but because they were interpreting his significance through their own theological categories. By the time Constantine made Christianity the state religion in the 4th century, that process had accelerated. The creeds were written to standardize belief across the empire. Alternative interpretations were labeled heresy. The texts we inherited came through that filter. Here's the thing about historical study. It doesn't destroy faith for most people who pursue it rigorously. It actually deepens it by taking the actual texts seriously, instead of defending an idealized version of them. When you read Mark's Jesus more vulnerable, more uncertain, more human than later accounts, it becomes harder to dismiss it as propaganda. It's too raw. When you see Matthew wrestling with how Jewish Jesus was, while writing to a Gentile audience, you recognize genuine historical complexity, not calculated deception. When you trace how Paul understood resurrection as spiritual transformation before later Gospels added physical detail, you're watching a community think through meaning over time. That's the opposite of fabrication. That's the texture of real human meaning-making in the aftermath of something that shook them. Now, some specifics about the sources themselves. Mark was written first, probably around 70 AD. It's the shortest, the most narrative-focused, and probably the closest to eyewitness recollection, though still filtered through one community's interpretation. Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, but added material, teachings, and stories that Mark didn't include. Approximately 200 to 300 verses of shared sayings material. Plus, Mark's narrative structure is the foundation for Matthew and Luke. John is fundamentally different. It uses a different chronology, emphasizes different teachings, shows Jesus as more explicitly divine. Scholars believe John either used different sources or deliberately reimagined the Jesus story for a different community, with different theology. Beyond the 4 canonical Gospels, other early texts survived: the Gospel of Thomas, fragments of other accounts, Paul's letters, the Acts of the Apostles, and later Christian writing. Each source, each fragment, tells you something about what different communities believed and valued. Taken together, they don't give you one consistent biography. They give you a chorus of interpretations, all rooted in some historical core, but shaped by theological conviction. The early church recognized this fragmentation. That's actually why they assembled the canon, choosing which gospels to include and which to exclude. It wasn't about finding the truest gospels. It was about standardizing what the church would teach across the empire. Other gospels, like the Gospel of Peter or the infancy Gospel of Thomas, were rejected because they didn't fit what the emerging church wanted to emphasize. This doesn't mean they were false or the canonical Gospels true. It means authority was consolidated around certain interpretation. Understanding how the Bible was assembled, not dropped from heaven complete, but constructed through human decisions by church councils, changes how you read it. Not whether you read it, just how carefully. One more piece: the historical Jesus' actual teaching was more focused on ethics and God's kingdom than on salvation doctrine. Later, Christianity made Jesus' death the central salvific event, the mechanism of human redemption. But Jesus himself spent most of his teaching time talking about how to live, how to treat others, how to understand God's character. The atonement theology, Christ died for your sins, develops primarily after Jesus' death in Paul's letters and later theology. It's not absent from the Gospels, but it's not their primary focus either. This is historically significant because it shows how the meaning of Jesus' death was interpreted and reinterpreted by different community. The Palestinian Jewish followers understood it one way. Paul understood it another.